Dear students, as you are all aware that it is a very memorable day for all of us in the Department of English, Karim City College, and for all of us in the Karim City College, because here we have a speaker who needs no introduction in the whole literary and cultural scenario of the country. Here is a guest speaker who, from the last 30 plus years, is serving the Indian literary scenario in one way or the other. And uh, when I requested her for this event, and the way she accepted our request, the way she said yes, it was a matter of great pride, and it was a matter of great satisfaction for all of us as organizer. Before we begin our event, I would like to request our respected principal, sir, Dr. Muhammad Riaz, sir, to accord a warm welcome to our guest speaker and also our participants. Dr. Muhammad Riaz.
Thank you, Yaya. Good evening, everyone. I am delighted to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished guest, Dr. Rakhshanda Jalil, faculty members and students joining us virtually today. It is indeed a privilege to have Dr. Rakhshanda Jalil with us, a renowned writer, translator, literary historian, and cultural activist. On behalf of the management of Karim City College, I feel honored to welcome such a great writer who has graciously agreed to share her insight with all of us. Writer Beyond Distance is an initiative of the Department of English, Karim City College, which it intends to open the doors of creativity for our students by introducing them to fertile mind across the globe. In the earlier events of this series, the department has welcomed several writers of the national and international repute. Today's interaction with Dr. Rakhshanda is the another one in the series, and we are all eagerly looking forward to a wonderful lecture. I congratulate the head Department of English, Dr. S.M. Yahya Ibrahim, for his efforts to bringing such an eminent writer to us, and wish the department a wonderful event today. I extend my best wishes to the department, its students, and its faculty members for a dynamic learning session ahead. Thank you. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for your words of encouragement, for love, for support. Dear students, as I was saying that here is a writer who basically needs no introduction in the academic and literary and cultural scenario of the nation. But just for the sake of our young minds, our young students, a small brief introduction about the guest speaker is here. It is just for you only. That Rakhshanda ma'am, as Professor Riaz sir was telling us, that she is a translator, she is a cultural activist, she is a literary historian. She is trying to, basically, I would like to say in one word, that she is basically a big name in the field of Indian writing in English translations. I basically personally and see to her and basically regard her and respect her hugely this way, that she is translating the great legacy of Indian literature, the great source of Indian literature for the English reading public of the country as well as the across the borders also. So ma'am is a writer, a critic, a literary historian. She has published over 30 books and more than 50 academic papers. She has published 6 edited volumes of short stories. Some of the titles are like this: Urdu Short Stories, 2002, a selection by Pakistani women writers called Neither Night Nor Day, 2007, New Urdu Writings from India and Pakistan, that was in 2013, and then Pigeons of the Doom, Stories of Communalism, that was in 2015, Preeto and Other Stories, The Male Gaze in Urdu, that was in 2019, then a collection of essays on the little known monuments of Delhi, which was titled as Invisible City, and that was published in 2008. And later its revised edition was issued in 2011. Then she co-authored two books. One was titled Partners in Freedom. That was a book on Jamia Millia Islamia, and that was in 2006. And then A Journey to a Holy Land, A Pilgrim's Diary, that was in 2009. She was also the co-editor of The Third Frame, which is basically a journal devoted to literature, culture, and society, brought out by the Cambridge University Press. She has edited and introduced a volume of essays entitled Kuratula and Heather and the River of Fire, the meaning, scope, and significance of her legacy, and that was in 2010, India, and 2010 by Oxford University Press in Karachi, also Pakistan. Some of her works, the translation works, are like this: Premchand's short stories titled The Temple and the Mosque, that was in 1992, and which was later revised in 2011 also. Then a collection of satirical writings in Hindi by Asghar Wajahat, that was titled as Lies Half Told, that was in 2002. 22 satirical cameos by Sadat Hasan Manto, and that was titled as Black Goddess. Rupa was the publisher, and that happened in 2003. Throughout the Closed Doorway, which was basically Nazms translated into English of the Urdu poet Shahriyar, and that happened in 2004. Short stories by Intezar Hussain, the famous short story writer from Urdu, and the book was titled Circle and Other Stories, that happened in 2004 India and 2012 Pakistan. A collection of Premchand's short stories for children, and that was titled as A Winter's Tale and Other Stories in 2007. Naked Voices and Other Stories, which was a collection of his stories and sketches by Sadat Hasan Manto and translated by her, that was in 2008. Panch Light and Other Stories by Hindi writer Fanishwar Nath Renu, and that was translated by her in 2010. Her translations of and short stories titled The Death of Scheherazade, that was in 2014. And this translation of Intezar Hussein's story, The Death of Scheherazade, was shortlisted for the Crossword Award, and her translation of Intezar Hussein's seminal novel Aage Samandar Hai, which was titled as The Sea Lies Ahead, by HarperCollins, won the German Embassy Karachi Lit Fest Pakistan Peace Prize Award in 2016, and the runners-up and jury commendation award for Muse India Translation Award 2017. She has been running an organization at Delhi called Hindustani Awaz since 2003, sorry. This organization, Hindustani Awaz, led by her, is devoted to the popularization of Hindi and Urdu literature and culture. And she curates an annual event under the banner of Hindustani Awaz, which is a day-long event. It's a celebration of Indian literary culture and Indian literary ethos of Hindi and Urdu and all. And it is titled as Afreen Afreen. Even her PhD work that was on progressive writer movement as reflected in the Urdu literature was published by Oxford University Press, titled Liking Progress, Loving Change. Another book, which was basically a biography of Urdu feminist writer Dr. Rashid Jahan, was published in India in 2014 and also in Pakistan, Karachi. Her recent books include Looking Back, that 1947 partition of India. Another book, 70 Years On, co-edited with Tarun K. Saint and Devjani Sen Gupta, that was in 2017. Footprints on the Zero Line, Writings on the Partition, translation of short stories and poems by Gulzar, and that was in 2017. The Traitor, a translation of Krishna Chandra's novel Ghadar, that was in 2017. An Uncivil Woman, Writings on Ismat Chuftai, that was in 2017. A critical biography of Urdu poet Shahriyar, that was titled A Life in Poetry, and that was in 2018. A Great War, Indian Responses to the First World War, that was in 2018. Kafiyat, which was a translation of Kafi Azmi's poetry or poems, that was in 2019. Jallianwala Bagh, Literary Responses in Prose and Poetry, that was in 2019. A collection of essays titled Identity, Culture and Politics and Literature, that was titled as But You Don't Look Like a Muslim. That was in 2019. And then more recently, Gandhi Nama, which was basically a translation of Akbar Allahabadi's poem, and that was in 2020. The Fall of Dhaka and the Creation of Bangladesh, Literary Responses in Urdu and Bangla, and that she co-edited with Devjani Sen Gupta, Orient Black Swan, 2021. Again, a selection of writing from Urdu, Bangla, and English entitled Bangladesh, Writings on 1971 Across Borders. That was again co-edited with Injani Singh Gupta, and that was 2022. A book, Urdu, The Best Stories of Our Times, 2023. Palopar, a translation of collected works of Gulzar, that was 2024. The Loharu Legacy, that is again 2024. And a very recent book, जिस पे आजकल बहुत बातें हो रही हैं across India, across the literary circle, Love in the Time of Hate, in the Mirror of Urdu Poetry, 2024. She has received a lot of awards, just to name a few. Kafi Azmi Award for her contribution in Urdu literature in 2016. The first Jawad Memorial Urdu English Translation Award in 2017. She is also the trustee of Ghalib Institute at Delhi. PEN, P-E-N, P capital, E capital, N capital, which is an international literary organization, and she is associated with the Delhi chapter of PEN. She is also associated with Seva Mandir Udaipur, and she is also the chairperson of Sarvodaya International Trust Delhi chapter. She is also serving as the board members of the Shankar Shad Mushaira, which is a very famous Mushaira of India that happens at Delhi everywhere, and that is organized by DCM Shriram Group. So I hope this much, this small little introduction, और ये बहुत थोड़ा सा है, मैं आपको बताऊं कि ये बहुत थोड़ा सा है, बहुत brief है. So here is a guest speaker, here is a writer, जिनकी खिदमात है ना, the services that she has done to Indian literature and culture, the way she has translated the books, the way she has taken the lead in literary researches, literary history and all. So we acknowledge that. We are highly indebted that she has accepted our proposal and our request to join. Rakhshanda ma'am, most welcome from my side also. The stage, the platform is now all yours.
Shukriya. Thank you very much, Yahya Saab. That was a very, very fulsome, very generous introduction to my work so far. Very grateful to the Kareem College. I have heard so much about it. I would have loved to have visited it, but the next best thing is to talk virtually to your students. I'm quite looking forward to this. And also to those who are listening and who have not just logged on and then gone away, what I would really hope to do is to give a very short talk and then maybe take questions from staff, faculty, whoever, students, whoever is listening to this. So as your poster has described, this is going to be a kind of a first-person talk. It's memoirish to the extent that I will talk about my personal journey as a translator, as a writer, and spanning 30 odd years, and how I have come to be in this position. And which is why I gave it the title that I did, which is From Text to Context. How I began first by looking at texts, and then increasingly my interest widened to the context. So I have written something which I would like to read. I promise you it's not terribly long, and then we can maybe take some questions. Yeah, yes, sir. Would that be all right?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
People.
Okay, so I'll start this little short presentation that I have with me. There is providence, it is said, in the fall of a sparrow. A chance meeting sometime in the year 1991 with Dr. Rao, the editor of Indian Literature, Journal of the Sahitya Academy, proved not only fortuitous, but had consequences far beyond any that anyone could have foreseen, least of all me. Dr. Rao was looking for someone to translate a particular story by Premchand. The story was called Mandir Masjid. He suggested, quite without preamble, that I should translate it and that he would publish it in his journal. He overruled my qualms about no previous experience at translating, let alone writing. I was then working as assistant editor at the India International Center in New Delhi and was perfectly content editing other people's often bad writing. Soon enough, I had pegged away industriously at my father's battered old typewriter and presented Dr. Rao with a translation, which he duly published in Indian Literature. This was the story called Mandir Masjid. The year was 91. The copyright for Premchand had just opened up, and anybody could translate Premchand. Little was I to know that the sequence of events that would unspool almost in slow motion over the next 3 decades from that chance meeting and that generous, almost avuncular suggestion would give birth to an undreamt of literary career. For someone with no literary ambitions at that point and no academic interests either, that single act of translation would prove to be the foundation stone for a lifelong vocation. Over 30 years later, I'm still building on that single serendipitous meeting. And to the young people listening to this talk today, I think there is a lesson here that sometimes not only do these chance meetings open up something that is supposed to be your real calling, but also there is no formula, there is no time frame, there is no single way of going about things or finding a career or finding what you truly want to do. Looking back, it seems as though I had tasted blood after translating that one Premchand short story. Within a year, in October 1992 to be precise, I had published a collection of 10 short stories by Premchand with HarperCollins called The Temple and the Mosque. Now, 92 is the year that HarperCollins had just started the India operations, and they too were looking for people to write for them. They were looking for Indian authors. They were looking for, ways to build their own India list. Called The Temple and the Mosque, it was a slim book with a very short introductory note called, rather self-effacingly, Translator's Note. Looking back, it seems odd that I was content to dub it so. Perhaps the sense of ownership I now have with the text was entirely missing then. What was also missing in that first book and in that translator's note was a desire to look beyond the text at hand. But I will come to that later. Let me tell you that I translate from Urdu and Hindi into English. I did a master's in English, so I have no classroom experience of having studied either Urdu or Hindi. So, whatever Urdu and Hindi I know today is what I have read from my own readings. I have no critical idiom in either of these languages, which is why when people ask me why don't I write in either Urdu or in Hindi, I think I'm slightly hamstrung by the fact that my entire education has been in English, and while I'm fluent and comfortable in these two languages, I do not have at my command a ready reference, a critical idiom, a kind of the kind of literary vocabulary one needs. Also, Urdu and Hindi have a very different register, a different kind of speech pattern, a syntax, as well as a cultural vocabulary when compared to English. Perhaps if I were translating from Urdu to, say, for example, Odia or Bengali or Marathi, I might have fewer problems, even though the two languages and the literatures associated with them have little in common. But since both Urdu and Odia or Marathi or Tamil or what have you belong to the Indian subcontinent, there are many things I can take for granted. It is not so with English. Apart from the purely technical aspects such as sentence structure, placing of verbs, the natural pauses in Urdu and Hindi, there is a huge issue of context. How do you translate cultural sensitivity? How do you translate something like, for example, those of you in this audience who are familiar with Urdu, you would have come across a word like jigar. Ye khalish kahan se hoti, jo jigar ke paar hota. Palib says, and so many other poets, both modern and classical, have used the word jigar. This is just one random example that I'm giving. Now, literally, it means liver, and it crops up repeatedly. But it is not used for liver in the anatomical sense. For the Urdu poet, jigar is a kind of an abstraction. It's not a part of the human body. It is not even an organ. Now, this is one example, but there are so many others. The scent of rain, living in very hot Delhi, this is a natural example to give. We are waiting for the rains to come. And the first impact of the rains on dry ground, that sondhi khushbu, there is a word for it in English called petrichor. But petrichor एक निहायत गैर शायराना लफ्ज है. So when you translate, you say moist or damp or something else. Gulzar Saab, for example, uses the word sond, sondi very often. But I wouldn't dream of using petrichor for his poetry. So these are just examples I'm giving you to convey what I mean by a literary and a cultural context to. I'll come to other kinds of contexts. I'll come to a political, a social, a socio-economic context, but for now, I'm confining myself to a cultural context. Elsewhere, there are images and metaphors that mean something automatically to those who belong to a certain culture. For instance, a kite with its string cut, कटी पतंग, ये एक फिल्म भी है और फिल्म एक पॉपुलर नॉवल पे बनाई गई थी. तो इंडिया में कटी पतंग means something. I don't have to explain what it means. I might have to explain what it means to a Western audience, but I doubt if I have to explain it to an Indian audience. So, with its string that is cut, which is dangling from a tree, from a turret, from a terrace, from a building, all of these things, they convey something. And there's something poignant about this. Similarly, to give you another example, Sehra, the strings of flowers, mogra or champa or chameli or whatever it might be, sweet scenting flowers that are strung before the face of a bride and in some cultures before the face of a groom. So the Sehra again is something that means something to an Indian audience. And I don't have to work very hard to convey that sense of poignancy, the tremulous scent of the flowers, how it conjures up the tremulous beauty of the bride, But for a Western audience, I think, this is a bizarre image of a groom whose face is covered with flowers or strings of flowers. So sometimes there are images and metaphors that are rooted in a culture and they do not require translation when one is translating between Indian languages. But when you are translating from an Indian language into English, you have one of two choices. You burden your translation with explanations and you make your text cumbersome and even clumsy. Or, and this is something I like to do, you retain the image and you allow the image to speak for itself. And when need be, you give a detailed introduction that sets out the contours of the context of your text. Now, this brings me to how I would have done that first translation differently. The translation that I did of Premchand's stories in '92 that HarperCollins published. It is my great good fortune that HarperCollins publishes it every 10 years. 92, 10 years later, 10 years later, and 10 years later. So we have 3 editions of this book. The book continues to be in print. Each time they change the cover, they give it a new cover. And I had the chance to rectify an old wrong. The very modest translator's note that ran into 3-4 pages that I had written the first time in '92. Over the years, I've expanded on that. Whatever I've learned, whatever I've experienced in those years as a translator, as a writer, I felt that I could add value to that translation. So in this instance, a fate or circumstances gave me the opportunity to fix something that I think needed to be fixed. Increasingly, in the 30 odd years that I've been translating and writing critical commentaries, I find I am more interested in the context. While, of course, the text too remains important, which is why I find it necessary increasingly to write a detailed introduction to the stories or the novel or the poetry, whatever it might be that I might be translating. Over the years, I've translated the fiction of Rashid Jahan, Manto, Ismat Chaktai, Krishan Chandar, Anishwar Nath Renu, among a host of others, and the poetry of Zehra Nagah, Kaifi Azmi, Shahryar, Javed Akhtar, and most recently, Gulzar's collected works. In one of my recent translations of Intizar Hussein's seminal novel, Aage Samandar Hai, which Yahya Saab referred to earlier, it was published in 2015 as The Sea Lies Ahead. I have even provided extensive footnotes. These to me seemed important in a literary work which was dense with cultural allusions. Now, translations seldom, if ever, carry footnotes. There is a glossary, and there are words which are non-English words which are provided in the glossary. But a lot of people find that a footnote is it gets in the way of your reading of a translated text. In fact, when The Sea Lies Ahead came out as a translation, while it got largely favorable reviews, a couple of the translators pointed out what they called my relentless translation footnotes. I feel that relentless or not, sometimes a very dense text, a text that has allusions, cultural allusions, or references, which make sense to the readers of that language, in this case Urdu, may or may not make sense to the reader of the language that I'm translating into, in this case English. So, for example, to take Intizar Hussein's example, he writes with a lot of references to early Islamic history, which may not be instantly revealing to an English reader, but which would require no translation, no explanation, no background, no footnote for the Urdu reader. Um, and also, Intizar Sahab has a cyclical way of writing. एक कहानी के पेट में से दूसरी कहानी निकलती है. अक्सर वो episodic होती है. उनकी novels भी episodic होती हैं. And apropos nothing, there will be a reference to Cordoba. And the English reader can get very puzzled कि Cordoba एकदम से बुलंद शहर के बीच में कहाँ से आ गया, you know? So I feel that sometimes my job as a translator is to provide that context which is there in the mind of the writer. But for a English reader, that to a modern day English reader, may or may not be accessible. Also, while I'm talking of Aage Samandar Hai, I want to talk a little about an experiment which I attempted when I was translating Aage Samandar Hai. I'm by no means a pioneer in this experimental form of translating. People have done this before, most notably the translators of Latin American works. Translators like Gregory Rabassa have done this. So what I was doing was that I did not read the entire novel before I started translation. I did not even read the entire novel when I had signed the contract with HarperCollins. The commissioning editor who commissioned this work had not read the work. It was a leap of faith. It was a leap in the dark. And we were just relying on Intizar Hussein's reputation as this amazing writer. And neither the lady who commissioned it at HarperCollins nor I had read it. And every day, I would only read as much of the text that I was going to translate that day. It could be a page, it could be a paragraph, it could be a few lines. It depended because the translation actually spread over a year or so. So I think that by resisting the temptation to read more than what I was planning to translate on any given day, I would like to believe that this experiment worked in favor of the translation, insofar as it gave a freshness, kind of a spontaneity to the translation. I think there is a certain all-knowingness, not a smug all-knowingness, but a sense of knowing where this text is going that a translator has. And that, I think, while a translator is a very close reader of a text, I think that sense of knowing can sometimes pose a hindrance. And I would like to believe that in this kind of experimental way of translating, there is that sense of knowing is missing. And I think that gives a sense of freshness, of spontaneity. Of course, later you go back, you edit it before you send it for printing. Of course, that editorial inputs are necessary. You fix tenses, you fix dangling sentences. But that very first translation, I think, is a fresh one. Try it. If those of you in this audience who are interested in translation, please try it as an experiment to yourself. Don't read an entire text. Read only as much as you plan to translate on a given day. Losses are inevitable in the act of translation, but taken in the balance, the gains far outweigh the losses. A work of translation, it is said, is like looking at the wrong side of a carpet. The pattern and outline is clearly visible on the wrong side. But what is missing is the sheen and color and the brilliance of the right side. So instead of being daunted by the losses, I do believe one should think of the immeasurable gains. अब आप सोचिए कि अगर आपने रशियन मास्टर्स ना पढ़े होते, अगर आपने मोपसा ना पढ़ा होता, आपने गैब्रियल गार्सिया मार्केज ना पढ़े होते, आपने पैब्लो नरूदा ना पढ़ा होता, तो टू यूज इन उर्दू वर्ड आप कितने महरूम रहते, हाउ bereft your world would be. Like some of you in this audience, I too studied English, and as an 18-year-old in my first year of BA, I had the Odyssey. And as an 18-year-old straight out of college, I was immersed in the world of Odyssey, the wine dark seas. I live in Delhi. I had not seen the sea till that point. But when I read the Odyssey, and I read Homer's description of the seas, I read the description of the great battle that was awaiting these warriors who were gathering and going, crossing the seas to go for this battle of honor. I think it left a huge impression on my mind. Maybe I didn't realize it at that point that it was an act, it was a work of translation. I read it on its own. But now when I look back, there was no one holding me by the hand and taking me through that translation. I think हम गलती करते हैं जब हम हर चीज को idiot proof कर देना चाहते हैं और अपने readers को bite sized information देना चाहते हैं. Why don't we just fling the reader into a sea, a new sea? I like to give the example of Homer's Odyssey because as an 18-year-old, you're reading something which is so different. At least in my time, it was very different. Now you have a lot of OTT content and other kinds of things that have come on. There's Troy. There's so many other Hollywood films made on it. But I'm talking of all those years ago when I first read Homer's Odyssey, and it was a new world for. Imagine also how bereft we would be in India if we hadn't read Vivek Shanbag or Ovi Vijayan or Mahashwata Devi or Perumal Murugan and many, many, many others. So I think this, while the losses are there, I think the gains far, far outweigh translations. Now I'll come to the central question that I had posed, I have tried to pose in the framing of the title. Why has the context become important to me? Perhaps I think it has something to do with a PhD that I decided to do late in my life when I was almost 40 years old, and it was 20 years after I'd done my master's in English. I didn't do that PhD for promotion or for career advancement or for any of those usual reasons. And doing it after a gap of 20 years, I don't think it meant that it was a long fallow period where I was idle. I think all of the reading and writing I was doing in that 20 years between the master's and the PhD was in some way, of course, not planned, not thought through, not strategized in any way, was leading me towards this PhD. The title of my PhD was The Progressive Writers Movement as Reflected in Urdu Literature. So all of the reading I had done from the Bhasha literatures, the translations I had done, many that actually came in handy for the PhD, such as Manto, such as Krishan Chandar, many of the things that I had been reading in those 20 years, they kind of, as it were, came in handy. I'd by then translated a fair amount of Ismat, Chuktai, I translated Bedi, Rajendra Singh Bedi, Krishan Chandar, Faiz. All of these people were part of this very powerful literary grouping known as the Progressive Writers Movement. And while this is not the occasion to go into those details, but essentially this was a movement that was active from the mid-30s and right up till the 50s and the 60s, when it began to peter out and diminish in importance. There is still a Progressive Writers Association. There are people who are working in it, but it is by no means the force to reckon with that it was for those 3-4 decades when it was a pan-Indian phenomena. While the great majority of people who were the engine that fueled the growth of the Progressive Writers Movement happened to be, as it were, Urdu writers, but There were Hindi writers, there were Marathi, Telugu, Tamil, Bangla writers. This movement went into almost all the major languages of India. There were progressive writers, associations, and meetings in all the Bhasha languages. Hyderabad, Calcutta, Bombay, these were all major hubs of progressive writings, and the local branches, and within that, smaller cities. Patna had Azimabad had a very active PWA, and so on and so forth. So uh, now I come to this business of context. When I began to work on the progressive writers movement and start my background reading on the on my thesis, I was working in a full-time job, but I took 1 year's leave without pay to write the thesis. But in the years that I was doing my background reading, I felt that my lack of classroom teaching in English, sorry, in Urdu and in Hindi was a hindrance. And I felt I needed to read Urdu literary criticism. So some part of my background reading was reading the work of people like Ali Ahmed Surur, Ehtisham Hussain, Ali Jawad Zaidi, Rashid Ahmad Siddiqui, Ibadat Barelvi. I also read, these are all major Urdu critics. I knew Urdu till that point, but of course, when I was doing all this kind of reading, my speed increased, and I was able to read with greater ease in Urdu. I also began to read memoirs and biographies of Urdu writers such as Josh Malyabadi, Rafat Sarosh, Miraji, Sajjad Zahir, Majroo Sultanpuri, Khwaja Ahmad Abbas. And these are all people who were in some way or the other associated with the progressive writers movement. And it was important, I felt, to understand the cross currents in literature, those who were with the movement, and as well as the handful of others who were not with the movement. And I needed to understand what were these compulsions. But more importantly, and this is again something that I would like students of literature to keep in mind, working on the thesis taught me to look beyond the picket fences of disciplines. I had been a student of literature all along. I'd studied English in my master's, and the only other subject I'd studied in a classroom was history, and that was as a subsidiary student, and that too at the undergraduate level. And I can tell you that was very, very elementary, very rudimentary. The little Urdu I knew was, as I have said before, it was self-taught, and therefore it was limited to fiction and poetry, and that too what I knew or liked. But the choice of my subject meant that I had to not just read up on other kinds of Urdu prose, memoirs, diaries, literary criticism, literary histories, but more importantly, I had to read up on modern Indian history, on the politics of modern India. My supervisor was a historian. And the first draft of my thesis that I showed him, he literally threw it and said that, listen, where are your primary sources? Now, this is important. We who have studied literature think of a text as a primary source. We think there's a primacy to the text. This is it. This is the edifice on which we make our argument. But not so. When you are doing something that is so interdisciplinary, I had to unlearn many things. I had to understand that the work of the professional historians also complement, supplement, add to our understanding of literature. I had to go looking for first-person accounts, private papers, archival works, and especially a movement such as this, which was deeply political in so many ways. I was also required to spend long hours in the archives, both the National Archives, the state archives. I spent an entire month in the British Library going through the secret reports, the intelligence reports, Khufia police as it was called. I had to look at a lot of archival material that would not have occurred to me had I made it just a text-based reading, you know. And also I had to understand a lot about the Communist Party of India, because the average person even today seems to think that the progressive writers movement was actually a left-leaning movement that was entirely led by communists. And so many people seem to think that it was an exotic foreign plant that had been grafted onto Indian soil, and it had this dramatic flowering. Not really. While yes, there were a great many people who were communists, who were members of the PWM, but there were many others who were fellow travelers who had a left-leaning worldview. Yes, but they wanted to make common cause with a whole bunch of big isms of the time: anti-colonialism, anti-fascism, anti-imperialism, nationalism, feminism, land reform, all kinds of things. So I had to go back in time and I had to understand where were all these things coming into Indian literature from. I had to go to the First World War, First War of Independence, the Mutiny of 1857. Even before that, what was happening, the annexation of Awadh, the Battle of Plassey, all of those things, because they were each in their own way significant political, social, historical landmarks. And because literature and society are intertwined, each one of them was in a way, there was a burst of political energy that was coming out of these, most significantly from the 1857 revolt. And each of these things were in some way changing literature. And of course, then there was the Russian Revolution, and there were other things happening in the rest of the world, which influenced Indian writers. Again, because this talk is not really about the PWM, I will not spend more time on that. I will come again to the topic that I have chosen for myself, which is the context and why that is important. Now, give me 1 minute, please. Now, while I continue to mine or revisit the work that I did during my thesis, because the subject is vast and there are still many things that I'm able to, as it were, excavate, I do find new ways of exploring the intersection of literature and history. A text or a collection of writings must primarily excite me. That is my primary impulse today. And one of the great joys of being unemployed and being an independent researcher is that you can pursue your own interests, that you're not bound by commercial or institutional interests. You can pursue your own interests. I have never done commissioned translations or taken on projects that don't interest me. I want to share the sense of excitement and wonder and awe that a text inspires in me, first as a reader and only later as a translator or a commentator or what have you. As I said, I am now interested as much in the context as the text. Let me give you some examples of how I harness this interest. I brought together a book called The Great War, Indian Responses to the First World War. Bloomsbury published it in 2018. This was literary responses to the Great War. How have Indian writers, जब कोई बहुत बड़ा सान्या होता है, तो जरूर उसका रिफ्लेक्शन लिटरेचर में मिलता होगा. ये मुमकिन ही नहीं है कि कोई बड़ी चीज हो, कोई बड़ा इवेंट हो और राइटर उसके बारे में ना लिखे. So this is the primary impulse that makes me go looking for those responses. This I followed up with another book called Jallianwala Bagh, Indian Responses in Prose and Poetry. This was published in 2019 by Niyogi Books. I don't need to give you these details because Yaya Saab, when he was introducing me, had mentioned my work on Bangladesh, which I've done with Devjani Sengupta, where I've put together a collection of writings in Bangla and in Urdu. But how was Bangladesh created? What were the events leading up to 1971 that caused a whole nation to be created? So now I'm also working with Devjani on the Great Bengal famine. What were the conditions in the 1940s that led to the Great Bengal famine? It was a man-made famine. Again, this is an intersection of literature and history. We've looked at how Bangla, Urdu, and English writers give another way of looking at the famine, which supplements, complements, adds to the work of the professional historian. So you have the political economists like Amartya Sen who talk about the reasons behind the famine. And then you have the creative writer, a woman sitting, an Urdu writer, a woman sitting in Allahabad, writes a story called Ek Pyali Chawal. How does she imagine the famine? naturally her imagination of it and her representation of the family is very different from Amartya Sen's, because he has at his disposal facts, figures, statistics, a whole scientific way of examining the economy and the political reasons for it. But this lady who's sitting in Allahabad, who's maybe just not just a graduate or not very educated, she's getting her information from newspapers, vernacular newspapers, Urdu newspapers. And how does she write about the famine? So there are ways and means. There's poetry, there's memoir on the famine, there's all kinds of things. So this has been occupied a lot of my work. Another thing that I quite enjoyed doing is writing biographies. I've written two so far. I'm working on the third one now. I've written the biography of Dr. Rashid Jahan. She was a feminist, she was an activist, writer, communist, doctor. Again, this is a wonderful example of how her life influences her work, which is why it's important to know about her life. I called the book Rebel and Her Cause. Now, how is she a rebel? She's what Gail Mino calls a daughter of reform, because her parents, her Papa Mia and his wife, are co-founders of the Women's College at Aligarh. They're deeply committed to the cause of women's education, and so they send Rashid Jahan first to Lucknow and then to the Lady Harding Medical College in Delhi. She becomes a doctor, a lady doctor as they were called then. And she is writing, she joins the Communist Party, she's an activist, she writes plays, she writes for the radio, she's doing a whole bunch of things. But what is important is for us, for our purpose today, she's writing the kind of stories that we've not seen in Urdu literature. She writes a story called Wo. She writes a play called Parde Ke Piche. Now, why are these stories different? Because we've never had a woman who's a doctor, who's writing with such natural ease about a woman's body, about women's reproductive health, about a whole bunch of things that have been considered beyond the ken. So it's important to understand why and how are these stories, which are so dramatically different from other kinds of writings. The one, I mean, there is my biography of Rashid Jahan, another one on Shahryar, and the one I'm working on at the moment is on Hasrat Mohani. Now, he's again a very interesting person who you cannot see in isolation. Of course, he's a poet, but it'd be a great disservice to write a biography where I limit him just to his poetry. Therefore, it is important for me to see him in its larger context. He's a journalist, he's a nationalist, he's a freedom fighter, he's a free thinker. He's member of the Constituent Assembly. He's a member of the UP Legislative Assembly in the years leading up to independence. He takes part in all the debates. He gets into these disagreements with just about everybody, with Gandhi, with Nehru, with Ambedkar. He has at different points in his political career been part of the Communist Party, the Muslim League, and the Congress. And at the time of partition, he decides to stay back on in India and be this conscientious objector. He's also a major poet. He's written Chupke Chupke Raat Din Aansu Bahana Yaad Hai, which has been sung by Ghulam Ali. So I can't see him just as a poet and just write a literary biography. You see, so it is therefore important to get into his politics and to get into, and he's written a great deal of political poetry, by the way, on the Rowlatt Act, on a whole bunch of things. So, Yaya sir, how much time do I have? I can wrap it up and take questions, or I can go on for a little bit more.
We have 5-10 minutes. Na?
5-10 minutes?
10-15 minutes to continue. Kari sakte.
All right.
Please.
Thank you. So my literary career, career is a grand word for this, for want of a better word, has been shaped by serendipity and projects and ideas finding me or vice versa. Though now when I look back with the benefit of hindsight, I can see that the text in isolation has seldom drawn me. It is very, very rare that I've looked at a text and not looked at its context. For example, when I was translating Gaddar, the novel that is located in the partition by Krishan Chandra, this is a time when this novel spoke to me in very many ways, because if you recall, there was a lot of unrest in the country, Hyderabad University, JNU, many other places. There was a lot of turmoil, and student leaders and others were being called anti-national. So the word Ghaddar or anti-national was being flung like a gali in parliament, in public discourse, in newspapers, everywhere. And so it seemed to me that important that this novel, written in the 60s but located in 1947, is also talking about Ghaddar. Who is a Ghaddar? Who is a traitor? जो भीड़ से खड़े होके भीड़ से अलग ख्याल रखता है, अलग सोच रखता है, उसको भीड़ कहती है कि तुम गद्दार हो। लेकिन क्या वो गद्दार है? अक्सर वो नहीं गद्दार होता है, बस उसकी सोच भीड़ से अलग होती है। सो मुझे लगने लगा कि ये इसको हालांकि ये 47 की कहानी है, लेकिन ये 2017 में 2018 में उस दौर में जब मैं इस पे काम कर रही थी, इट वाज वेरी वेरी रेलेवेंट, इट वाज वेरी टॉपिकल. Another example I want to give you is that of Panishwarnath Renu. I was living abroad for a year and मैं अपने साथ कुछ हिंदी की किताबें ले गई थी और उनमें से एक फणीश्वरनाथ रेणु की किताब थी. और मुझे अभी भी याद है कि मैं बेल्जियम में थी और मैंने आत्म साक्षी नाम की एक कहानी पहली दफा ट्रांसलेट की. उस वक्त तक ना मैं बिहार गई थी, ना मुझे बिहार के बारे में ज्यादा कुछ पता था, लेकिन इस कहानी में कोई चीज ऐसी थी जो मुझे लगा कि दिस इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. एंड फिर मुझे समझ में आने लगा कि इस कहानी में जो चीज मुझे सबसे ज्यादा अपनी तरफ आकर्षित कर रही थी वो ये थी कि इसका कॉन्टेक्स्ट क्या था. जो ग्रास रूट लेवल पे कम्युनिस्ट मूवमेंट था, उसका उसका डिक्लाइन कैसे हुआ, उसमें लोगों में रुचि तो बढ़ी लेकिन डिसएंचेंटमेंट भी आया, उसकी क्या वजह थी. रेनू इन सब बातों का बयान करते हैं. फिर मैंने 10 के करीब 12 उनकी और कहानियां, व्हेन आई केम बैक टू इंडिया I translated more of those stories. It was published by Orion Black Swan as Punchlight and other stories. बट मुझे ये लगने लगा कि रेनू की जो अपनी पॉलिटिक्स थी वो परमिएट करती है इस पूरे कॉन्टेक्स्ट को, इस पूरे उनकी सारी राइटिंग्स को. उनको हिंदी में कहा जाता है कि वो आंचलिक कथाकार है, यानी रीजनल राइटर है. बट रेनू को पढ़ने के बाद मुझे लगने लगा कि उसमें कोई चीज आंचलिक नहीं है, कोई चीज रीजनल नहीं है. वो बातें करते हैं जो हम सब की दिलचस्पी है की है. और एक और चीज जो मुझे रेनू को ट्रांसलेट करके समझ में आई, जो मैं बार बार इस लफ्ज का इस्तेमाल भी करती हूँ, इस एक्सप्रेशन का, द पर्सनल इज द पॉलिटिकल. यानी ये एक स्लोगन है, शायद आपने सुना हो, ये फेमिनिस्ट मूवमेंट से निकल के आया था और कहा जाता है कि पर्सनल को भी पॉलिटिकल बनाया जा सकता है. हमने देखा है कि बड़े राइटिंग की खासियत शायद यही है कि पर्सनल को कैसे पॉलिटिकल बनाया जाए, यानी जो आपकी दिलचस्पियां हैं और अक्सर जो आपकी अपनी जिंदगी में हुआ है वो कैसे आप उसको एक ऐसा जामा दें, एक ऐसी शक्ल दें जो ज्यादा से ज्यादा लोगों की समझ में आए. So I can think of no better way to put my training, and I use the word training because largely self-taught, in what is literary history. So this दो धाराएं हैं, लिटरेचर और हिस्ट्री, और वो यूं आके मिलती हैं. तो जहां वो आके मिलती हैं वो काम है लिटरेरी हिस्टोरियन का. तो मेरे जैसे लोग जो हैं, जो लिटरेरी हिस्ट्री में दिलचस्पी रखते हैं, हम उस इंटरसेक्शन को टटोलने की, खोजने की, समझने की कोशिश में लगे हुए हैं. और ये वजह है कि हमारे लिए ट्रांसलेशन तो है ही इम्पोर्टेंट, क्रिटिकल कमेंट्री इम्पोर्टेंट है, बहुत सी चीजें इम्पोर्टेंट है, लेकिन हमारे लिए वो इंटरसेक्शन, वो कॉमन स्पेस इम्पोर्टेंट है. So, yeah, Sab, I think I will close here. I can go on about other things, but I'd like to close here and maybe take questions from your audience. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, please. Dear audience, if there is any query or whatever you have felt, your observation, your questions also, please feel free to ask or say something.
मेरा स्क्रीन दिखा रहा है कि there is 63 people. तो अगर आप में से कुछ लोग भी जगे हुए हैं और सुन रहे हैं, तो होपफुली आप लोगों के कुछ सवाल होने चाहिए.
Yes, and we have Gurubdev Singh sir also.
Sorry?
Gurubdev Singh sir is also here.
I can't hear, sorry.
Professor Gurubdev Singh is also here.
I see.
I request Professor Gurubdev Singh sir. Sucharita Dan ma'am is also here. So if there is any question from their side or any remark, and then the students, please. Anyone, please?
Yeah. Thank you very much for naming me. I'm Guru Desh speaking. Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are audible.
Yeah. I just want to say thank you very much. Big thank you to Rakshanda Jalil because her talk has been very useful and she has been able to sum up the exact spirit of translation. I liked her metaphor of the carpet, the other side of carpet and the real side. This is true. To me, I think the most often that metaphor that I use is that it's like some kind of a software that computer experts make, and they go on revising them. No translation is perfect. They have this, even Windows have got so many revisions, so translations also go through a lots of revisions. And the second thing which I think she made very clear is that you cannot do translation of the text without its context, the historical background, or even the subtexts. They lurk behind every text. And I think any translator who is in the business of doing this thing probably knows this. I shouldn't say it, but I think I have also done a little bit of it. I have done a full book on Nasir Kazmi's ghazals. And while doing that, I realized what she was saying was absolutely right. Thank you very much for at least
Thank
confirming
you.
my ideas.
Thank you.
Thank
There's
you,
a
sir.
question from Meenakshi Malhotra.
Yeah, please.
I'm very glad that Meenakshi is here. I must tell this audience that Meenakshi and I go back to a very long time. She is a professor at Delhi University, teaches in one of the colleges, but she and I were together in both our graduate and our postgraduate years, and I had the occasion to meet her recently. Very happy to see you here, Meenakshi.
Yeah, hi. I enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank you.
My question was about, this is something I experienced. Again, I am not well versed with the theory of translation, any theories as such, but nor do I translate on a regular basis. But from Bangla to English, I found that, registers of translation vary. And in Bangla, there's a very clear demarcation between a colloquial idiom and a formal idiom. And that was not always very easily. I mean, for instance, the aap, tum, tu. And this
Yeah.
is an example I always give.
Yeah.
English, it's all you. You don't say thou and thy.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously. So how does that work out with Urdu? Because I'm not familiar with
Yeah,
the
yeah. Urdu
yeah.
also has tu, tum, aap, and which is absolutely not there in English. So there is nothing you can do about it. There's certain givens. I mean, there's no point fretting over the fact that it's not there. It just isn't there. French has it, but English doesn't have it. So to show that informality of speech that tu denotes is not there in aap, obviously, which is very different, and tum, which is again very different. It would be used in different ways for somebody younger, somebody inferior in social status. I'm sure it's much the same in Bangla. I think it's like that in several Indian languages.
Yeah,
So,
and not only in terms of
yeah.
class and sociality, but also intimacy. That in what context, when the aap between, say, in a romantic relationship becomes a tum, what does it
Right.
mean? So
I
that
have these conversations with Bangla translators, often with Arunava Sinha, with Devjani and others. And yes, these are challenges. But as I was trying to say, as translators, we become a little, what shall I say, stoic. We accept that there are challenges, but that doesn't stop us from translating because, as I say, we in turn, as students of literature, have benefited from translation. So we understand the value of translations, but we try and work around it. One easy and, to my mind, lazy way is to introduce jargon or colloquialism from the language that you're translating into. I personally don't approve of it. Let me give you an example. I see people using the word guy instead of person or fellow, and they think that the context has that true and it has that easy familiarity in the original. So let us use something like guy. But I feel that guy, to my mind, is too American, has a totally different context. So I am less concerned with, with worrying that am I keeping to the two tum aap register. I'm happy with the you doing my work, but somewhere in that sentence, I am now I don't have a example in hand to give you, but I would say that one refrains from using a colloquialism from another literary culture and insert it in a cosmetic way into a literary culture where it doesn't fit. Guy being or howdy or uh, fellow or
Yeah, that rings very false. Yeah,
like
absolutely.
yar. So what I have started doing, and this is not laziness on my part, but a great deal of thought has gone into this. I increasingly use yar because I might give yar in a glossary later. But I want to keep yar and not say buddy or mate. Mate is so American, buddy is so American, mate is UK, that to colloquial, and something else is very Australian sounding, something else is very American sounding, and it doesn't fit in there. So instead of saying buddy or mate or bloke or this or that, I'll just keep yar there, you
Yeah,
know?
and one more point I would like to add here, translations over time. I mean, for instance, I find Tagore a very bad translator of his own work because
Who
he
is?
uses very maudlin
Who,
Victorian
who, who
prose.
is?
Tagore, for instance,
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Bangla. Yeah, his translations to us, read like passages of purple prose, and
yeah,
that happens because he is obviously talking, translating 100 years ago, and his Bangla idiom doesn't feel at all dated, but his English sometimes is quite stilted, and it's very Victorian, though it is, correctly speaking, more Edwardian perhaps. But the point I'm making here is that when you use bloke and all, it's like the first generation people who were thinking of a putative audience in Europe or the US. Here now, when you are translating across cultures within India, I think it's your target audience changes entirely, right? So
yeah.
I feel that also makes a difference because you
Of
can
course.
use yar and you know uh, some terminology without feeling conscious about.
Yeah. So to supplement your example of Tagore, let me give you the example of Kuratullah and Heather, who did a master's in English from Lucknow University. And in the early years, till other people rescued her work, she used to love to translate her own writings from Urdu because she felt that, she'd done a master's in English and she was perfectly fine to, well equipped to do it. But I think she did a great disservice to her own writing by insisting on translating herself, for the same reason that her English was quaint, was outdated. She was talking about people in negligees and things like that, which just didn't make sense to a 21st century reader. And so instead of attracting, I think our job is also to get people to read what we translate. We don't do it for our own pleasure. Once it's published, it ought to go out to people and people ought to buy the book and read it. So I think like in Tagore's case, Tagore has found over the years other people more in sync, more in time with the exigencies of the times, who are better equipped maybe to translate Tagore than Tagore himself, as in the case of Heather.
Thanks. Yes, I'll let others carry on. Yeah. Can't hog your,
Yes, ma'am.
all the questions.
Sucharita ma'am wants
Thank
to say
you.
something.
Thank
Sucharita,
you.
please. Sucharita Datta ma'am.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you for that wonderful talk. And yeah, I don't know whether my question is right in this context, but after what Meenakshi ma'am just spoke, I wanted to know, when you're translating your own work, when you're translating, do you need a certain kind of a distance from the source text? And is it difficult for a writer to translate herself, is there a lack of distance in that sense? And does that make the translation a little more challenging than
What do
if
you
it
mean
were
by distance?
translated.
In what sense?
If you're
What?
so close to it, so the language, does it affect the language in any way because you're close to your own text? Is it easier for somebody
No,
else
I
to
think that
translate
discipline
as
comes with time. I think that discipline, like I said, you are a close and a faithful reader. That is the prerequisite of any active translation. You're reading it more closely than you would as a casual reader when you are translating. That goes without saying. But I think with time, you learn to detach yourself. Um, an element of subjectivity will be there. We are not translating, we are not commercial translators, we are literary translators. We are not translating the washing machine instructions or something like that. We are translating texts mostly that we have liked, you know. So yes, there is a subjective element, but I wouldn't say that it colors a translation. I'm sure know that there is this other school of thought that talks of transcreation. I personally don't
yeah,
subscribe to that, but there have been. I mean, Purushottam Lal talked of transcreation, and which is that you take a text and you create something else, your own understanding
right?
of text. So I personally don't subscribe to the idea of transcreation. I think
Mm,
transliteration works very well, which is lipi antar in languages like Urdu and
mm,
Hindi, because just changing the script can serve the purpose. That is fine. Otherwise, it has to be translation, I think, and not really transcreation. Um, I think the distance that you are talking about narrows in transcreation in the sense that you feel that um, you can transfer this text in any which way that you want. In a translation, you're conscious and aware that this is somebody else's work, and while you may be very invested in it, but you cannot. I mean, you keep your ego, you keep your sense of self for your own right. You don't bring that into the actual translation. Does that answer what you are asking?
yes, yes, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I hope Dr. Atya ma'am wanted to say something or ask something. Dr. Atya.
Who?
Dr. Atya ma'am was here. She was raising her hands. Dr. Atya ma'am, are you here? Okay. So it is a student's time now. And चूंकि वक्त काफी हो गया है, so we'll take just one or two questions from the side of the students. So students, please, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Anyone? Anyone?
I think they've logged in and gone away.
स्टूडेंट्स की तरफ से मैं एक छोटा सा क्वेश्चन लाइक ए स्टूडेंट पूछ लेता हूं मैं, because since you have translated prose and poetry both, so my first question is that since and most of your translation is from Urdu or from Hindi also, of course, so which one is matlab comfortable for you, translating the prose pieces into English, the Urdu Hindi prose pieces, or the Urdu Hindi poetic pieces were more comfortable for you as a translation? I hope this is a very subjective question.
Actually, I have translated very little, virtually no Hindi poetry from Hindi into English. Oddly enough, the translations I've done from Hindi have been prose. I would be hard pressed to think of any Hindi poetry that I've done from the top of my head. I actually can't think of any. I may have done something, a fragment here or there to convey a larger point, but most of my poetry translations, as a matter of fact, have been from uh, Urdu. I think I've done some Neeraj, but Neeraj writes Nazm and वो भी आजाद नज्म. तो problem to असली challenge हमें होता है when we are doing the ghazal, because as you know it's got a very compact structure. It's got this haiku-like compactness. It has an internal rhyme. It has a rhyme that is carried on A, A, B, and so on. So, that has challenges, but no, I have not translated into Hindi, so I'm not really qualified to answer that.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Is there any question from the side of student?
Can I ask a question? I am not a student per se, but
Please, sir, please.
yeah. So, Rakshanda Sahib, I mean, early on in your talk, you kind of gave a theory of, I mean, your theory of translation, which you said, also chimes with the American translators, where you said it's not actually necessary, or as you take it, I mean, it's not necessary to read the entire work in one go before translating it. I mean, you were saying that uh, if you translate as you go on reading, I mean, you read a small chunk of text and then translate it, and then incrementally you go on, rather than first doing multiple readings of the text and then thinking that you are qualified enough to actually now you should actually enter into the translation, the field of translation. So I mean, at the same time, you also emphasized the importance of context. So I'm wondering, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I find there is some kind of tension here, because uh, on the one hand you are saying that, okay, I mean, you do not need to read the entire text, and on the other hand you are emphasizing the context. So I believe in order to understand the context, we also need to read the entire oeuvre of the the writer or poet, or I mean whoever. But I mean, so
Maybe,
can you
yeah, I've understood.
clarify it?
Maybe I didn't, maybe this didn't come through very clearly. This is an experiment I've done in only one instance. This is not something I do each time. And this is an experiment that I did with the novel of Intezar Hussain, Aage Samandar Hai. And I gave the example of Rabasa and others who have also done a similar experiment. But this is not something I do each time. Apart from that one instance, I have not done this again. And even in that one instance, um, there were multiple revisions, there were drafts, there were footnotes, all of which were inserted and added at various points in time. So it's not as though what I did in the first shot, the first translation from that first reading went into print. That can't be. And I haven't repeated it again, but it was an experiment and a very interesting experiment. That is the point I was trying to make.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. Respected audience, it's time to say goodbye to each one of you. On behalf of my college, the management of my college, and on behalf of the people at our English department, my students, my colleagues, from all of us, I express a deep sense of gratitude, a lot of thanks, and a lot of indebtedness of our guest speaker. Rakhshanda ma'am, thank you so much for accepting our request.
Thank
And the way you basically said the things, put up the things, was very interesting for our students as well as for all of us. The way you talk about losses and gains, you're talking about context and its contemporary relevance also. You talked about history and politics and how history and politics intersects with literature. So, best wishes, ma'am, for your biographies on Asad Mohani.
Thank you.
We'll be waiting for that. So, extremely grateful, ma'am. Extremely grateful to you.
Thank you very much, Yahya Saab. It was a pleasure talking to you and your students.
Thank you, Guru Desai sirs, Sucharita ma'am, Meenakshi ma'am. Thank you, Samina Khan ma'am. Also, extremely grateful. And dear students, we are grateful to you also. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Good night.